At the time this video was recorded, The Simpsons has aired a total of 761 episodes. It's currently in its 35th season and is already contracted for season 36, making it the longest-running scripted primetime show on American television. And despite gradually decreasing ratings, it's showing no signs of stopping anytime soon. But nothing lasts forever, and that means at some point, somewhere, somebody will write the final episode of The Simpsons. I think the question of how their story should end is a fascinating thought experiment. How do you send off a family of characters who, for 1/3 of a century, have been one of the most popular symbols of modern American life? So let's explore that question on The Art of Storytelling. If you're like me and you grew up in the 90s, then you probably have fond memories of watching the show every day when you got home from school. And you've probably watched the first 10 seasons many times over. The show is, of course, known for holding up a mirror to modern America, each character personifying some aspect of American life, whether it's politics, entertainment, education. You'd be hard-pressed to find any subject or issue that has not been critically examined in the American microcosm that is Springfield. But the show is more than just satire. It has a surprising amount of humanity and emotional depth as well. And you know the stuff I'm talking about. It's Homer saying goodbye to his estranged mother and then sitting on the hood of his car and looking at the stars. Or there's the pictures of Maggie that he puts up at his workstation to conceal the demotivational plaque put there by Mr. Burns. Or the time Bart and Lisa had flashbacks to their childhood memories of one another and chose to hug instead of competing against one another. There are lots of examples, and this is not the cheap moralizing you often find in other sitcoms of that era. There's real wisdom and heart in these stories, and I think that accounts, at least in part, for the longevity and cultural impact of the show. So whatever that final episode ends up being, you can guarantee it will be a major television event, if television still exists, and an important cultural touchstone, certainly for my generation. And you can bet that the writers will be under a lot of pressure to get this ending right. Luckily, those writers will have some reference for how a sitcom should and should not take its final bow. So let's look at two 90s sitcoms that take very different approaches to ending their stories. The show Friends ends on a very bittersweet note. Chandler and Monica start a new life as parents, and each character turns in their apartment key as they prepare to move on to the next phase of their lives. It's sad and beautiful and an appropriate conclusion to a story about young people living in the city, and it was generally well received. There are a few laughs in there, but the final scene is definitely a dramatic scene more than it is a comedic scene. This makes sense because the characters in Friends develop deeper and more serious relationships with one another as the show progressed. By contrast, there's the notorious final episode of Seinfeld. That show ends with the characters being locked in prison for their indifference in witnessing a robbery. It's the first and only time the characters face the consequences of their sort of casual selfishness. It was an awkward tone to end the show on, and this ending was generally not well received. That said, the ending of Seinfeld is also appropriate for its characters. Seinfeld was actually specifically written to contrast the sentimentality and moral resolution that were common tropes in sitcom writing at that time. Apparently, Larry David's mantra for the show was no hugging, no learning. So there isn't a single moment of seriousness in that show. George's fiance literally dies on screen, and it's played for laughs. So it would have been a portrayal of that philosophy to have Jerry and Elaine getting married at the end, or George finally becoming confident, or Kramer getting his life together. It just wouldn't work. But I think Seinfeld is nonetheless a cautionary tale. It shows us that audiences have expectations about character resolution, even in cases where those characters are deliberately and specifically written not to have an arc or any kind of dramatic depth. I think this shows that The Simpsons ending can't just shrug off the responsibility of giving the show's characters a meaningful resolution. One suggestion put forth by longtime Simpsons showrunner Al Jean is that the last episode would end where the first episode started, with the Simpson family heading off to a school Christmas pageant, putting the show in a kind of never-ending loop. And I'll admit there is a kind of poetry to this idea, and it is appropriate for the show's unique brand of absurdism. But again, this is where Seinfeld went wrong. Jerry's last line of dialogue in the last episode is actually the same as his first line of dialogue in the first episode.
The second button is the key button. It literally makes or breaks the shirt. The second button literally makes or breaks the shirt. Look at it. It's too high.
In theory, this wraps things up in a neat little bow, but in effect, it just evades the responsibility of actually resolving the characters. And if it didn't work for Jerry Seinfeld, it probably won't work for the more dynamic and sympathetic characters of The Simpsons. So naturally, in order to write the end of a story, we need to think about the moral of the story. And in order to do that, we need to look at how the protagonist changes throughout the story. In most storytelling formats, this is pretty straightforward. It's usually pretty clear who the main character is and how that character changes throughout the plot and what the main themes of the story are. But the format of a serialized TV sitcom makes that analysis much more difficult. Who is the story's protagonist? Is it Homer? Well, he probably features most frequently as a main character in the show, but that doesn't necessarily make him the protagonist. No! A story in which there's an equal distribution of focus among several main characters is called an ensemble cast, and I think that's the right way to think about The Simpsons. The entire family is the protagonist, and their collective character development is where we need to look to find the story's moral arc. Discerning a plot is also really tricky because, well, the story is made up of 761 individual plots, and the show's special relationship with time means there can't really be much in terms of linear character development. The citizens of Springfield live in a continuous present. This is sometimes called a floating timeline. So Bart Simpson has featured in 35 Halloween specials and 21 Christmas specials, and in all cases, he's 10 years old. There are some rare moments in the show in which a minor character undergoes some kind of permanent change. So I'm thinking about the death of Maud Flanders and Apu having octuplets, both of which happened in season 11. But as for our main characters, they generally just respawn on the couch every Sunday, having forgotten whatever lesson they learned the previous Sunday. And this means there really isn't much of a narrative through line for the Simpson family, and therefore no obvious dramatic resolution that the plot is leading towards. As for the show's main themes, it's also kind of tricky. The show's sheer breadth of subject matter means that it has explored just about every aspect of the human condition. But if we had to boil it down, we'd probably land on words like family and community, and of course, the great subject, America itself. So with all that in mind, can we make a reasonable case for how the final episode should end? Well, I actually think that an episode already exists that basically provides the template for how to write the final episode. It's called Home Sweet Home Diddly Dum Doodly, and it aired way back in 1995. This is the one where Homer and Marge are found to be negligent parents, and Bart, Lisa, and Maggie are taken away by Child Protective Services, and their foster family turns out to be the Flanders.
Welcome to your new home, neglectorinos!
This is a brilliant device for testing the character of the Simpson family, and that's, of course, something the final episode will need. The climax of the episode has Ned Flanders trying to baptize the children, but Homer arrives just in time to save them from salvation. The fact that the children have to be rescued from a ritual of religious purification is really funny and says a lot about the Simpson family. And there's a beautiful little moment when Maggie has to decide which family she belongs to, and we see her connection with Marge. The last shot of the episode is the Simpson family walking into the sunset together, making jokes about how lame the Flanders are. And if something like this was the last we see of the Simpson family, I think that would be very much appropriate. To me, this ending strikes exactly the right chord and checks all the right boxes because it really understands who the Simpsons are. They're not an ideal American family. They're a real American family, and that's why we like them. There are a million ways that this send-off can be funny and subversive and do all the things that make the Simpsons fun to watch. But the one thing it absolutely must do is respect the bond of family that is the moral center of The Simpsons. But I guess we'll have to wait and see what the final episode ends up being, if the show ever ends. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please subscribe if you're interested in the art of storytelling, and I'll see you on the next one.